Chapter 6. Sunday was hell. On Monday, Nick woke up as wrung out as he could remember feeling in a long time. He lit his second cigarette before he even got out of bed. Putting the ashtray on the nightstand had been a terrible move, too encouraging. Christ, he needed to get serious before he really started to backslide. He couldn't eat breakfast, too emotionally hungover from yesterday. He just went to work, head down, drank too much coffee, accepted Brad and Jess's condolences with polite neutrality. He had to do the paperwork. The body of a teenage girl was in the room below his feet, and he had to fill out the paperwork for her funeral. He stared at it without working on it for a long, long time. Brad opened the door without knocking and brought him a plate with a steaming square of lasagna. Looked homemade. Brad set the plate on the desk and crossed his arms, glowering. Eventually, Nick looked up and demanded, "What?" "Eat that," Brad said, and sat down in one of the visitors' chairs. It was the one the mother had been sitting in yesterday. So Nick ate his lunch in belligerent silence while Brad looked out the window. "Those plants are doing good," Brad said, eventually. "I'm amazed," Nick said, blowing on hot pasta. He shoved the bite in his mouth. "I can kill just about anything. Plants, I mean." "Do not," Nick said, "ask me about Vash right now." Brad heard and respected Nick's tone and didn't ask about Vash. He had to grudgingly admit that he felt better once his blood sugar wasn't bottoming out, and he was even able to fill in the paperwork. 16 years old, female. Cause of death, multiple trauma and blood loss resulting from being flung from a car. She hadn't been the driver. Her best friend had been the driver. Her best friend, still alive in the ICU, with the driver's license less than a month off the press, who had fallen asleep at the wheel. Just a micro-sleep. Long enough to veer off the highway. Because they'd been out so late, had just wanted to get home and go to bed, and one girl had trusted the other so implicitly that she'd gone to sleep in the front passenger seat, and her best friend had been so tired. Nick supposed it was a small miracle he hadn't had a case this difficult before now. But death, on the whole, wasn't synonymous with tragedy. He'd presided over an awful lot of sorrow in the last few months, yes, but not very much tragedy. He hadn't been prepared for talking to her parents. They were so quiet and so kind. Everything they'd said had made Nick feel like a punching bag way more than screaming or recriminations would have. Late in the afternoon, his phone buzzed. He picked it up. "Can we talk in person tonight? Saloon, 8? Nick stared for a moment. He knew of the bar called the Saloon, but he hadn't been before. Wanting to talk in person was a good sign, right? Or exactly the opposite. Buffering the conversation with booze could be good or bad, too. "Absolutely," he sent back. He finished out his office work, made a few calls. His voice was remarkably steady. He'd always been good on the phone. At 6 in the evening, the cosmetician showed up. An older woman named Andrea. Nick met her when she came in. "Hi, Andy," he said. "I don't know if you've heard who you're working on, but—" "I've heard, dear," she said, and offered him a quick one-armed hug, which he accepted. "It's awful, but I've done these things before." "Okay," said Nick. "How are you holding up?" "Oh, fine," he lied. "I'm fine." She gave him a sad smile. "I'll get to work, then. Will young Mr. Chidari be in tonight?" "I think so, yeah," he said. "You okay with just Livio around? I have to leave soon." "Yes, I'm just fine. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Wolfwood." He hung around for another hour anyway. He wasn't sure if he should try to go home and change, or if he should attempt to find some dinner before heading to the bar. He settled on eating a pack of ramen in the funeral home kitchen, taking comfort in the carbs and sodium that had always been there for him. With half an hour left, there was simply no way he could kill more time without completely losing his mind. He packed up his stuff, waved Livio goodnight, and hopped on Angelina. He'd already checked the directions to the bar. It wasn't too far away, just on the other side of downtown. The name made him worry it might be some theme bar, but once he stepped in, the saloon turned out to be average in every way. Low light, loud voices, slightly sticky floor, different sports with conflicting volumes on 3 different TVs. Nick headed to the bar itself and picked a stool near the end, far enough away from the other patrons that he might be able to avoid getting asked his opinion on the game. Any game. He ordered a local that was on tap. It wasn't great. Bitter, weak, overcarbonated. He sipped it anyway and grimaced, checking his phone. He was more inclined toward whiskey generally, but he didn't want to get too much of a head start, and a pint was easier to nurse. He'd gotten here way too early. He'd barely gotten through a quarter of the glass when he spotted a flash of red by the door. Vash was also early, by more than 15 minutes. Nick raised a hand and caught his eye from across the bar, and saw Vash's eyes flash wide before his easy grin settled in, and he walked in Nick's direction. "This is embarrassing," Vash said, sliding onto the stool next to him. He was wearing the red coat again. He unbuttoned it in the warmth of the bar, but didn't take it off. "Thought I'd beat you here." "More embarrassing to be me, I think," Nick said. "Got so little life I couldn't kill another half an hour doing anything else." Vash laughed. "Well, that, and I kept you waiting for 2 days," he said. "I know that was mean." "Still is," Nick said mildly, telling his heart rate to calm the fuck down. The bartender came over and asked what he could get Vash. "Wild turkey double, straight up," Vash said casually, and Nick immediately wanted to kiss him. Not that that was unusual. "Make it 2, Nick said to the bartender, gently nudging the pint glass to the side with his pinky finger. Vash waited quietly until the drinks were set in front of them, hands up on the bar, clasped. Or rather, he wrapped his bare right hand over his gloved left, which didn't move much. Nick leaned on his elbows, waiting. He knew why Vash was being quiet when the bartender's attention was partially on them. Their little neighborhood of shops and friends was a pocket of pride in an otherwise iffy prospect of a city. May was better than December, though, on the whole, as far as places to be publicly queer went. "You want to get a table?" Nick asked. A quick glance around didn't show any obvious openings, though. Vash shook his head. "Gotta be louder to talk across a table anyway," he said. His shoulder was very close to Nick's, fabric brushing fabric. Here they could almost put their heads together. "Okay." Nick picked up his bourbon and sipped. It was extremely orange forward, with a black pepper kick on the back. Not his favorite, but a hell of a lot better than the beer. "You stalling so you can let me down gently?" Vash just smiled into his glass and took a hefty swallow. He set it back down and angled his head up. "What would you do if I put you through all this and said thanks but no thanks anyway?" Nick glared. "Respect your wishes like a normal fucking human being," he grumbled. "Why, you want me to chase you?" Vash's face pinked a little. He sipped his glass. "It's kinda nice," he said. "Makes me feel wanted." Nick gave a disbelieving huff. "That all? I can make you feel wanted plenty of other ways," he said. The pink got distinctly pinker. Nick realized how suggestive that had sounded, but decided the hell with it. He stood by the statement either way. Vash cleared his throat lightly. I talked to Knives," he said, trying to sound casual. "And?" "And was told in no uncertain terms that... Okay, well, first that he didn't want to know jack about my dating life," Vash said, half laughing. "Which is fair. But also that if I didn't get out of the house and have a dating life, he might lock me out, or smother me in my sleep or something." Nick's heart thundered in his ears. He sipped bourbon, waiting for the calming burn to wash through his chest, and said, "And that means?" "So, I'm in," Vash said slowly, swirling his glass. "If you'll have me." Nick resisted the powerful urge to make another double entendre, so all he said was, "Yes, please." Vash looked at him sidelong. "So this is officially our first date, I guess?" he asked slyly. Nick snorted. "Come on, pigeons in the park has to count." "That was pretty sappy," Vash said agreeably. "Says Mr. Talks to the Animals." "What can I say? Pigeons love me." "Because your hair looks like a nest." "Excuse you." "Vash." "Yeah?" "Do you want to hang out and chat at the bar?" Nick said carefully. "Or do you want to take another ride on Angelina?" Vash looked him dead in the eyes, his smile not at all innocent, and said, "I'd rather ride." A beat passed. Nick slugged back the rest of his bourbon in one go and hurriedly fished in his pocket for his wallet. A gentleman," Vash said, teasing but quiet. "Paying on the first date." "Don't get used to it," Nick said, putting down more than enough for 3 drinks and a tip. Vash finished his drink in 2 long swallows, head tipped back, throat thoroughly distracting. Nick could not jump this man in a crowded bar. Being arrested would make the rest of the evening problematically difficult. His hand itched to reach out and grab Vash's, tangle fingers, pull him to move faster. But he didn't. He left the bar as casually as he'd entered, Vash nearby, smiling easily and waving at a couple of faces he half recognized. Thank God above, no one stopped Vash for a casual catch-up chat. Nick might have had a mental break on the spot. "How'd you get here?" Nick asked, heading around the side of the parking lot toward his bike. "Bus," Vash said. Nick unlocked the helmet, handed it to Vash. You should invest in that second one, Vash said before he slid it over his head and fastened the strap. Muffled, he half yelled, Do they come in red? It's my favorite color. Asking for handouts pretty early, aren't you? Nick said, mounting up and making room for Vash to join him. Firm believer in safe equipment for heavy machinery, Vash said, close to his ear. So sue me. Nick made a touche face and kicked the bike to life. This time, the cold wind in his face did nothing to slap any sense into him. All the way to his apartment building, he was hyper-aware of Vash's arms around his waist, one hand on his stomach, the other straying higher. He got them there in one piece, but the distraction was a real, tangible thing. The face of a girl in the funeral home's basement, quiet and still, even now being made carefully beautiful again, flashed into his mind. He took deep breaths and focused on driving, not on the hand on his chest, not on the chest against his back, the breath that might have been on his neck if there wasn't a visor in the way. His hands shook when he parked and got off the bike. Vash passed him his helmet, futzed ineffectually at his own doomed hair. Nick led him between two buildings, up a couple of flights of wrought iron stairs. His apartment complex wasn't exactly upscale, but neither was it a dump. Families lived here, not just broke college kids room sharing for rent. Every apartment had an outside door, more than half of them adorned with some kind of fall decorations. Nick's was blank, just the apartment number and the peephole. He got it unlocked, pushed inside, flicked on the lights. He barely had time to slide the helmet onto the table by the door before a lithe body was sliding inside after him and crowding him up to the inside of the door. He pushed it shut with his back, fumbled for the deadbolt blindly. He couldn't look back at it because Vash was already in his face, orange-scented whiskey breath and sea-green eyes and a lip half-bitten. Nick surged up to meet him. Kiss number 3. Not the hopefulness of the first one, the caution of the second. This one was all urgency and need, hot slide of tongues and quick stolen breaths. Nick dragged Vash hard against him, sandwiched between Vash and the door. He rolled his whole body into Vash's, and Vash met him, knee between his legs, hip to hip, tongue in Nick's mouth, a moan in his throat. Vash's hand stayed up around Nick's neck and shoulders, directing his head so Vash could kiss him absolutely breathless stupid. Nick's hands found Vash's chest, his buttoned coat. He tugged by the coat, worked a few buttons open, got his hands inside and slid over Vash's chest through just the one layer of shirt. Worn cotton. Vash was warm through it. Nick groaned into his mouth, tugged his hips closer again, wanted to make sure he wasn't alone here and how fucking hard he already was, the blood rushing hot through his head into his groin and nowhere else. Instead, Vash broke from his mouth with a panting groan and winced and said, Shit, can we slow down a little? Fuck, said Nick, hands loosening on Vash's hips. Sorry, did I... too much? No, Vash gasped, leaning back in to kiss again. No, He pressed his mouth to Nick's, as though addicted, unable to form words when his fix was right in front of him. Nick led him for a long minute, melting into it, tongues over teeth and under each other, the heat still swirling steadily in his gut. But knowing Vash wanted to slow down helped him keep his head. He dropped his hands from chest to waist, just holding Vash steady, focusing on the making out. Finally, Nick broke away and tipped his head to the side when Vash unconsciously chased his mouth. Hey, he murmured. Earth to Spiky. Vash gave a faint whine of complaint. Mixed messages, Nick hummed. Vash sighed and tipped his forehead against Nick's. I know, he said. I've just been wanting to do that since you walked into my store. Kiss my face off? Nick asked, all slow-spreading grin. Exactly. What else you been wanting to do to me? Nick asked, rasping a little. Vash shuddered. Can't say, he said. A lot. Oh? Vash brushed his mouth over Nick's again. Soft press. Against his lips, Vash said, I really meant to talk about this more before we just dove head first. Nick rubbed his hands up and down Vash's sides, comforting, showing that he wasn't going any further. So talk, he said. Is there a couch or something? Not that this isn't great. You're the one who put us here, Nick reminded him. Oh. Vash blinked at the door behind Nick. Yeah. Nick pushed Vash back a few steps and gestured to indicate the room. Mi casa es su casa and all that, he said. It wasn't much. The front door led into the living room, with a narrow sofa, coffee table, budget TV. Off to the left was an unimpressive kitchen, dishes piled in the sink that Nick would definitely have washed if he'd known this was going to happen. The bedroom was down the back hallway. Nick didn't suggest they head straight there, but rather led Vash over to the couch. He had to hurriedly shift a slew of papers off one side, onto the coffee table. Vash hesitated for a moment, then finished opening his coat and slid it off his shoulders. He laid it over the arm of the couch and sat down next to it, looking suddenly much less certain of himself. Nick took his coat off too, and then his black suit jacket. He sat next to Vash, half turned, leg under opposite knee, and leaned his elbow on top of the sofa back. "What's going on?" he asked Vash quietly. Vash let out a groaning sigh and leaned forward over his knees, face in his hands. He scrubbed his real hand hard over his eyes. "This is embarrassing, I guess," he said, as if he wasn't sure one way or the other. "But I'm not a virgin by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm not very experienced. I just want to be upfront about that." Nick reached over and brushed his fingers through Vash's hair behind his ear. Vash shuddered and sat back up, leaning into the touch. "That's it?" he asked. "That's not enough?" "Hey." Nick slid his hand down the side of Vash's neck, tugging him closer. "If you just want to make out, all you have to do is tell me." Vash was flushed a beautiful pink. He looked at Nick's lips and his tongue flicked out to touch his own. "I mean, I don't want to just make out," he said. "To be clear." "But you want to go slow?" "Slower." Vash huffed a rueful laugh. He lifted his right hand and traced Nick's bottom lip with it. "Listen," he said quietly. "I got hurt when I was 17. There wasn't much chance for scoring bases or starting relationships when I was in traction for months and physical therapy for years, living with my mom." He sighed. "It's only been pretty recently that my body doesn't just hurt all the time. So I want a lot, Nick, really. I want everything. It's just, the spirit is willing, you know?" Nick had slowed his touch to no more than an easy stroking at the base of Vash's hairline. "Vash, I am absurdly desperate to make you happy," he said, serious as anything. "Any part of me you'll let me touch, I won't know how to do anything but worship it, I swear." A darker look flickered over Vash's face. "We'll see," he said. "No, hey." Nick glared at him. "You don't get to say that. What?" Vash gave him a pointed look. "The hand?" Nick asked, incredulous. "I don't care. Did you think I would care?" "It's not just a hand," Vash said, his general brightness dimming even more. "There's a lot, okay? I've got a lot of scars. I don't really like people to see. No one has except knives and, I don't know, a long time." "Okay," said Nick. "So you can keep your clothes on if you want, but—" He grimaced and gave Vash a pleading look. "Can I show you something?" Vash looked bemused, but hummed a yes. Nick sat up and started unbuttoning his shirt. Lust flashed over Vash's face again as he watched Nick's fingers deftly pop each button, uncovering more chest. He was reasonably hairy, and Vash was clearly not put off by that, which was nice to see. He tugged the cuffs loose and pulled off his shirt. Vash was practically drooling, but Nick focused his attention by sitting up, leaning a little to the side, and spreading his fingers over a small pockmark at the very edge of his abdomen. "Is that ugly?" he asked Vash seriously. "What? No." Vash frowned at him. "It's where I got shot," Nick told him. "Accidental, airgun. Just a flesh wound. But the memory's ugly." Vash stared at him, quiet. Loaded. Considering. Nick turned around, hunched his shoulders a little to make them stand out, and asked, "Are those ugly?" Slowly, Vash's fingers touched the tracery of thin scars over the top of Nick's back. Long stripes, thin, as though from a blade or a whip. Vash's voice was a little strangled when he said, "No, of course not." "Okay," Nick said, heart loud in his ears. "So, when I got these, from a foster home, did that ruin me somehow?" "Nick," Vash said, "when I fought back with a knife and hurt the bastard so bad I have a sealed juvenile record for assault with a deadly weapon, is that—" Nick trailed off, throat dry. He swallowed hard. "How ugly's that make me?" "You're being a real bastard right now," Vash whispered. Nick chuckled, humorless. "Whatever you're seeing on me," he said, "I can imagine. Because I still want to kiss you, too." And Vash was on him, turning him around, mouth rough and breath ragged, and Nick kissed back like his life depended on it. He wondered if they were done going slow for the moment, because Vash certainly wasn't. He pressed Nick back into the couch cushions, shifted his weight over and threw a leg over Nick's. One more shift and he'd be in Nick's lap, grinding right in the sweet spot. Nick gasped and clutched his neck and devoured him right back, spreading his legs a little, encouraging whatever Vash wanted to take. Vash curled the fingers of his prosthetic hand loosely around Nick's free wrist and guided it down the front of his body. Nick took the cue and cupped the front of his pants. Vash was hard, hot through the fabric, and he moaned into Nick's mouth and finally shifted his weight up that last little bit. Fuck, Vash's hardness against his own, even through too many layers. Nick was going to lose his mind. And on top of that, Vash's right hand vanished from Nick's neck and started working down the buttons of his own shirt. Nick wanted to help, but he also didn't want to stop holding Vash's hips so he could grind up and feel the shower of sparks sinking into his skin every time the pressure was just right. Nick finally managed to get away from Vash's mouth enough to start kissing along his jaw instead, back to the hinge under his ear. Vash shuddered and pushed against him, fingers shaking on his shirt. He finally got it open and leaned forward, chest to chest, and Nick sucked in a breath against Vash's neck, his hands going back around Vash's waist and down to cup his ass. Uh-huh, Vash moaned, rolling his hips. You're killing me, Spiky, Nick told him, so hard the inseams of his slacks was starting to hurt. How slow is slow? I don't know, Vash gasped, dipping his head to Nick's shoulder and baring his teeth against Nick's collarbone. He rolled his hips again, gasped, let it out on a low whimper. I want to see you come, Nick told him. Fuck, Vash squeaked. Later, Nick promised. Can you shift up some? No. Pants, Vash. Vash groaned complaint, but he scooted back enough to give Nick room to hurriedly work open Vash's fly first, then his own. Vash's shirt was hanging open, but Nick couldn't see much in the shadowed space between them. He realized that there were strips of dark material crossing the top of Vash's chest. They looked comfortable, molded to him. A harness of some kind. But that didn't matter nearly as much as getting Vash's jeans unbuttoned and unzipped and wriggled down as far as the limited space would let them, and Vash was clearly not ever going to get up off his lap so they could actually take their pants off, so this was plenty. This would do. Boxers down, Nick's own slacks and briefs wriggled as far down as he could get them, and then Vash's cock was in his hand, the soft slide of skin over incomparable hardness, burning up to the touch. The sounds Vash was making now were pure music. Nick couldn't help moaning, too, when Vash quickly licked his palm and took hold of Nick in return, just feeling him out at first. Long fingers dancing up Nick's length and playing with the head, thumb around the edge, gentle over the slit and then sliding back down. Shit! Nick gasped against Vash's neck, bucking. Please, Vash whimpered, widening his grip to encompass both of them, repositioning his hips and driving forward and down, fucking the channel of his fist with Nick right next to him. Nick hauled his head down and kissed him bruisingly hard. Vash panted and worked his hand and his hips and made absolutely beautiful noises into his mouth while Nick burned up inside, fully on fire, the ache of furious need almost too much to even allow a peek to get close. There was tension in every part of Nick's body, and he wouldn't classify this as going slow, generally speaking, but rational brain decisions about relative speed were not welcome at the moment. Vash was controlling the speed. Vash was the one who wanted to control the speed, and if Vash developed a lead foot and suddenly pushed the pedal to the metal, Nick was fully here for that. It wasn't more than 5 minutes. 5 sweaty, urgent minutes. Vash came first, his breathing changing, his hand getting tighter and faster, and Nick all but sobbed against his neck, unable to escape how good it felt even if he had wanted to. Cum hit his stomach, hot and wet, and Nick was blown away by Vash's face, fully lost in some other place, absent in a higher plane of existence, maybe, except that even as far gone as he was, he still whimpered, Nick. And that was it. Nick was done. Orgasm hit so hard it almost hurt, ripping through his hips and up his spine, tensing his body like a seizure of holy shit, yes. He gasped and panted down, muscles trembling, the back of Vash's neck in his hands, Vash's face leaned against his. Vash kissed him sloppily, drugged, uncoordinated. He gingerly let go of their cocks and touched Nick's stomach, spreading his fingers through the crime scene splatter pattern, resting his palm on Nick's belly and feeling him breathe. Vash, Nick finally managed, into Vash's mouth. Vash made a helpless noise. Can I just... My leg is going to sleep. Huh? Vash said dreamily, but he finally deigned to draw his head back, look at Nick with the tiniest bit of distance. He said. Scoot, Nick told him, pushing at his hips. With a vague noise of complaint, Vash disengaged and got off Nick's lap, sitting shakily to his side. Vash said, and swallowed. Not just you, Nick told him. I mean, how good that was. You're not imagining it. Oh. Vash gave him a long, lazy blink. Okay. Good to hear it. Nick thought about telling Vash it was some of the best he'd ever had, but decided against it. He didn't know what "not a virgin by any stretch of the imagination" meant when Vash said it exactly, but it was true of himself as well, and there was no point comparing notes right now. But if Vash ever did worry about his adequacy, Nick was thoroughly up for the job of assuring him that he'd had way worse sex with way more experienced people. Vash took a deep breath, blew it out between pursed lips. I think, he said, I don't know what slow means. Nick started laughing. It was contagious. Before long, Vash was giggling so hard he started hiccuping, which made Nick laugh more, and Vash dragged him close and kissed his face all over before burying his own face in the hollow of Nick's throat to finish hiccuping down from his buoyant hysteria. Nick held him around the shoulders and rubbed at the tight muscles at the back of his neck, top of his back, until his fingers encountered a strap of some kind. Oh, right. Nick rested his head on top of Vash's ruined hair and looked down the loose back of his shirt. Still deeply shadowed, but he could just about make out the harness he'd noticed earlier. Oh, said Vash, shifting in Nick's grasp and sitting up. He looked alert again, but still relaxed, happy, not bothered by Nick's explorations. Right, he said, and moved to start tugging his sleeves over his hands. You don't have to, Nick said, seeing where this was going. Vash shook his head. I want to. He shrugged his shirt off his shoulders. Nick took it in and tried to remain calm, reminding himself that this all happened years ago. Vash had already said it didn't hurt much anymore, that he was getting better, always making progress, always healing. Still, the bottom dropped out of Nick's stomach whenever his mind so much as brushed over the thought of how bad this must have been when it happened. Nick had thought his prosthetic must be more than just his hand, but he hadn't imagined Vash's skin ending right below his bicep, leading into worn black plastic and scratched metal. Scars littered the rest of his torso, too. Paler ones and redder ones, railroad stitch marks, some thin, some raised, some shiny and taut. Obviously all centered back towards his left side, all roads leading to the point of contact with some horrible, devouring beast that had chewed him up and spat him out. Nick tentatively reached out and touched a long stripe over his stomach near his belly button. Vash audibly swallowed. So, he said, thank God for ribs. All the important stuff is inside a bone cage for a reason, right? Broke a bunch of them, but they kept my heart and lungs and all of that out of the line of fire, so I lived. He put his hands on top of Nick's, flat over the stomach wound. A combine does a bunch of different stuff at once. It's got the cutting blades, rotation, thresher, gears, so you can't get a simple injury, really. Cuts, punctures, and crush, all together. Nick moved his hand up Vash's chest, held it over his heart. There was a patch of rough skin there, too. I'm so sorry, he said, because there was nothing else he could think of. Vash nodded. Sometimes I thought I'd rather have died, but I'm glad I didn't. He looked up at Nick, eyes a little watery. I'm so glad I didn't, he said again, helplessly. Nick's lips were tender by now, almost even sore, but he had to kiss Vash. Had to. Vash kissed back just as gingerly, tangling his fingers with Nick's, rolling closer on the sofa, leaning in. Nick wasn't sure how long that went on, because it was all lost in a haze of, I get to do this now. I can drink in all I want. I can do this until I'm sick of it. Except he kept not getting sick of it. Eventually, they were rescued by Nick's leg cramping up from his odd position. He rolled away and stretched it, muttering, ow, ow, while Vash laughed at him, melting into that dopey grin again. Shirt off, scars on display, hair a disaster, Vash was no less gorgeous than he'd ever been. Once the Charlie horse passed, Nick flopped out on the couch, boneless. His stomach was a tacky, drying mess, and he really needed to go clean up. He looked over at Vash. So, what's slow from here? Vash rolled his eyes and lolled his head back on the couch. I don't know. Let me ask you this, Nick said, contemplatively. Do you want to go home tonight? Vash gave it a moment's thought. Not really, he said, voice low. So. Nick pushed himself to his feet and held out a hand. Vash took it and stood. Let me wash up, he said, hands going to Vash's waist. And in a bit, we can go to bed early. Vash raised an eyebrow. Good night's rest is important, he said. If you're planning on resting, Nick said. Vash grinned. Despite talking a big game, however, Nick didn't end up directly in bed with Vash, making sweet love all night. Practicalities got in the way, first of all. He cleaned himself up in the bathroom, got his pants back on straight, and went out to the kitchen to find Vash, pants up, shirt still off, washing his right hand in the sink. It had never occurred to Nick that he had to wash one-handed. "Can you get that wet at all?" he asked, coming up behind Vash, who twitched, glancing over his shoulder. "It's fine if it gets splashed," Vash said, flexing his thumb over his palm to scrub between each finger, rinsing off suds and flicking the water off. "But I can't hold it under running water, no." Huh. Nick got a nice long chance to steady the prosthetic arm under bright kitchen lights, from all angles. The elbow joint looked complicated, with carefully packed wires and cables visible beneath the plastic housing. The harness connected across Vash's chest and back almost like a shoulder holster for a gun, a broad pad on top of his left shoulder anchoring the straps. Making sure he was in Vash's line of sight, so Vash could say no if he wanted to, Nick stepped close and reached out to touch the harness, feel its texture. "Don't get fetishy on me now," Vash said, but his grin said he wasn't really concerned. Nick snorted. "Does that chafe?" he asked. Vash shrugged. "I've been told I'm the rare cis man who sort of experiences what it's like to wear a bra every day," he said. "By Meryl. Meryl's who said that." "Of course she did." "But no, I have a really good fitting team." Vash lifted his left arm and flexed it. For the first time, Nick got to watch the play of his muscles as he moved it, and he realized that the motion was far more translated through Vash's chest and shoulders than he'd thought. "I didn't get any kind of prosthetic at first. Just let it heal and tried to learn how to do everything with the stump. But Rem called my bluff, told me I didn't have to tough out something I hated because I thought we couldn't afford this kind of thing." "Rem," Nick murmured. "Sorry, my mom. Not sure why Knives and I always called Rem and Alex that instead of Mom and Dad, but—" Vash shrugged. "Left over from their good old days in the hippie commune, before they adopted us." He smiled softly. Nick shook his head. "You've had a hell of a life," he said. "I could say the same," Vash told him, leaning back against the counter. "I would love to know how a juvenile badass turns into a funeral home director." "With an almost stopover at priest along the way," Nick said. Vash's eyebrow shot up. Nick smirked and stepped between Vash's legs. "And queer as the cherry on top." Vash's eyes crinkled in a grin. "The hippie commune stuff does lend itself more easily to that," he admitted. "Gay?" Nick asked, curious. Vash made an sort of face and said, "Anyone, everyone. People are just so pretty." Nick laughed. "Fair. I say I'm bi, but I haven't attempted to date a girl in 10 years, so." "You can still be bi." "Sure," Nick said easily. "But I can't say I'm too interested in women right now." He leaned close to Vash, bodies pressed lightly together, and dipped his head, kissed the side of Vash's neck. Vash tilted his head and said, a little shaky, "Is it late enough to go to bed yet?" "Mm-hmm." Nick kissed up Vash's neck to his jaw. "Stubble's really, Vash mumbled, hand going to Nick's waist and twitching there. "Really doing it for me." "Good," said Nick. Vash sighed, leaning into the touch as Nick switched sides and kissed under Vash's other ear. "I don't have anything, like toothbrush, change of clothes." Nick pulled back. "I think I can cover you for a toothbrush," he said. "My shirts are going to be too big for you, though, Scarecrow." Vash sighed again, tilting his head back. Well, I can do the yesterday's clothes walk of shame thing. It's not like Knives won't figure out where I've been anyway." He snickered. Nick laughed with him. "Not to get too blue, Vash, but I think you're not the only twin who needs to get laid," he said. Vash groaned loudly and wrinkled his nose. "Don't make me think about it," he whined. "Like I don't know." Nick patted his chest sympathetically. Vash huffed out a sharp breath and pulled Nick's hips closer so that Nick could feel that Vash was definitely recovering. You know it's really freaking hard to do with only one hand and your brother trying to sleep in the next room? Vash said, voice low. He slid his real hand down the back of Nick's pants, squeezed his ass. Jesus, Nick said, grinding into Vash. Priest, huh? Almost, Nick snapped. Want to hear that story? Not now, Nick said, hand going to the front of Vash's jeans again, fiddling with the button. He slid his fingers under the waistband. Are we even going to get to the bed? He asked, moving his hips against Vash's. Yeah. Vash moved his hand to Nick's shoulder and pushed. Nick made himself back up to give Vash some room. So, the thing is, I don't sleep with this on. He bent his mechanical elbow again. Is that going to be too weird for you? Nick's brows pinched. He shook his head at Vash. You've got to stop that, he said. I'm fine, okay? I just need you to be comfortable. Vash looked off to the side. Okay. He swallowed. Where's your bathroom? Nick took his hand and led him out of the kitchen, showed him where all the other doors in the apartment were. While Vash closed himself in the bathroom, Nick walked around the place, making sure all the lights were off except in the bedroom, checking the locks on the door. He collected Vash's coat and shirt from the living room couch, took them to the bedroom and shook them out. The only furniture in here were bed, nightstands, and a halfway decent dresser he'd gotten at a thrift shop. He laid the coat out over the top of the dresser, smoothing down its front. He shook the shirt out and almost folded it over his arm to lay atop the coat. But he stopped, brought it up to his face instead. It smelled like earth and green things, old leather, orange zest whiskey, and fresh, clean sweat. Even the sharp chemical traces of his hair product around the collar smelled good. Nick breathed deep. I'm right here, Heath Ledger, said Vash. Nick turned, embarrassed. He tossed the shirt on top of the coat. Vash was standing in the bedroom door grinning at him, his hair damp and down, holding his disconnected left arm in the crook of his right. Huh? Nick asked. Have you not seen that movie? Vash asked. What movie? Brokeback Mountain. Nick shook his head. I haven't watched much, sorry. Didn't grow up with a TV or any money to go to the theater, and I never invested the time later. Oh. Vash took a cautious step into the room. We didn't have a TV when I was little either, but after this... He hefted the arm. Kinda had a lot of time on my hands stuck in bed. I've seen pretty much every TV show and big movie from the last decade, whether I wanted to or not. Ah. Nick stepped aside as Vash walked up to the dresser. He laid the prosthetic arm down on top of his shirt and coat with a soft thunk. That movie's sad, Vash said, by Nick's shoulder. Brokeback really got me. I'm a crybaby at sad movies. Nick took his hand and tugged him up to the side of the bed. Vash leaned close, paused as if questioning. Nick didn't kiss him quite yet. Voice low, he said, I've got condoms and lube if you really want to fuck now. But? Maybe that can be what we take slow, Nick said. Save it. Vash huffed a laugh. You're not going to break me, he murmured. Not what I was thinking, Nick told him. I don't know. Call me a sap. I just don't want to blow through every first all at once. Vash leaned their foreheads together and said, Sap? Ass, Nick retorted, and this time when Vash leaned in, he met the kiss. This time, Nick pushed Vash gently to the bed, was the one who climbed on top. He worked Vash's jeans and boxers off and got to admire him fully for the first time, nothing but himself, flesh and blood. He started with Vash's chest, one nipple intact and one partially marred by a ragged scar. Vash's breaths came rough under him, his hand in Nick's hair and down the back of his neck, squeezing gently. Down his belly, Nick finally thought to ask, Do any of these hurt? Not like that, Vash said. Not to the touch. Okay. You want me to avoid anything? Yeah, everywhere except what you're already avoiding. Vash bitched, bucking his hips up to point out Nick's blind spot. Nick grinned. Patience, he said. Vash gazed at him, the echo of a glare. Get naked, he said. An order Nick had no problem obeying. He got up, stripped out of his pants, and crawled back over Vash to kiss him. Vash tugged his hips down. Half-formed ideas about sucking Vash off until he screamed dissolved into the gentler reality of rolling hips together and kissing, never possible to get enough of Vash's beautiful mouth. Nick was harder than he'd ever been in his life, the cock sliding against his, setting his spine on fire, but he also wasn't urgent. It felt like ocean swell, that huge and ineffable motion, which looked slow but was more powerful than anyone could ever hope to stop. Vash was sucking a spot onto Nick's neck when Nick realized he was close, that he'd gotten near the edge and barely realized. With a ragged breath, he got his hand between them and repeated Vash's move from earlier, holding them together, barely stroking, just making the rub tighter, the friction more. Vash! Nick gasped into Vash's neck. Fuck! God, you're so beautiful, Vash said, voice taut, and Nick spilled, toes curling, shivering all over as he held himself up on one arm and worked his cock with the other. Nick looked down between them. His cum was all over Vash Flush's direction, and that made another roiling shudder of pleasure wash through on the tail end of the first. Not a second orgasm exactly, but so close as to almost make no difference. Dizzy high, Nick kissed Vash's neck and moved his hand, grabbed Vash's and pulled it in between them. Can I see you, he rasped. Touch yourself. And Vash made a high, thready sound, like I didn't know it was possible to be this turned on, and started jerking himself off, descending quickly into the rapid movements of come right now, please. The sound was slick, and Nick's reactive pulse of arousal actually kind of hurt at this point. Vash's back arched, and he came hard, crying out, his interrupted arm moving instinctively upwards in a familiar way. He wanted to grab something above his head, hold on to something. Nick would bet money Vash could feel the ghost of his own fist forming, trying to be an outlet for a feeling so overwhelming Vash didn't know where to put it. Nick leaned down and nipped lightly over Vash's collarbone, making Vash shudder under him, still working out the end of his climax. Nick pressed his face into Vash's neck, waiting for his breath to slow, waiting for the moment to pass. Vash's stump arm slid out to the side, beneath Nick's head, and it felt so normal to be here, resting on top of his boyfriend, Nick supposed he should get used to saying. He grinned against Vash's skin and laughed breathlessly, elated, stupid with happiness. At length, Vash managed, I can't believe I have to go work tomorrow and just act normal. What's not normal? Nick asked teasingly. What is normal? Vash made a pained noise. Don't do freaking philosophy with me right now. Nick laughed and shifted his weight so he was lying along Vash's side. Livio's gonna give me so much shit, he murmured. Do you have tissues or something? Vash mumbled, rolling his head to look at the bedside table. A few minutes later, with the mess cleaned up, sweat mostly dried, and bed covers pulled back, Nick lay down next to Vash again and reached over to click off the light. He pulled up the blanket and settled with Vash's back against his chest. Vash's intact arm was bent beneath his head, under the pillow. Nick wrapped an arm over Vash's waist. Is this going to be too hot? Nick asked, breath ruffling the hair on the back of Vash's neck. I don't know, Vash said. It's been a long time since I slept with someone else in the bed. Same, Nick admitted. He breathed deep, his chest pressing to Vash's skin. Maybe it would be too hot in a while, but he couldn't get enough of it now. Sorry in advance if I kick. I'm pretty sure I don't snore. I feel like Knives would have yelled at me about it by now. Nick smiled in the dark. I snore, he said, but last time anyone told me, they said it was real soft. I'll kick if it isn't, Vash said, and Nick could hear the smile in his voice too. The lull of Vash's breathing against him, the soft dark of the room, and the aftermath of multiple orgasms all ganged up to push Nick fast down the well of sleep. His eyes slid shut. He couldn't fathom ever being uncomfortable again. I guess, he mumbled. We'll see how it goes. He thought he heard Vash whisper something back, but it was muddled, and then Nick was out.